disciples. And as his disciples, our faith in God is everything. Everything. You likely remember these 3 timely and always relevant lessons that we had last year. Some allusions to last year were made. These dates marked some very difficult times or uniquely tough times for us. And we wanted to help build your faith in God. One of the approaches we took was just to look at a few of the 5 times that Jesus rebuked his disciples for having little faith or unbelief. Of course, we put a positive spin on all of that. And the context of each of those rebukes reveals a different foe of faith, a threat to the faith that is everything. In these 3 lessons, we addressed the foe of fear in Matthew 8, the foe of anxiety and worry in Matthew 6, and the foe of doubt in Matthew 14. If you need a refresher course, they're on the Vimeo page. If you need another training session with the truth contained within those lessons, just go to our vimeo.com/Oak Hill website and go to those dates or to the spotlight or the showcase link and look at all of those lessons again. Obviously, today's lesson is just continuing this idea, and the thumbnail isn't here yet because I'm giving the lesson now. It will be something like this or something like this or maybe something like this, because I like holding up the Bible for a thumbnail. That's a good thumbnail. This Bible is the foundation for all things that we do. It's the truth that we build our lives upon, and it is the ultimate standard and authority for all religious matters. That's a bold stance because it is from God. This lesson, this foe, is so powerful, it's so sinister that it needs to be slayed every day. And yet it's also very sly. It's so sly and so subtle that it can only be detected, and all of its methods of attack can only be detected by enhanced spiritual vision and by our own humility before God. If we don't have or lose either one, we won't see how this foe can sneak up on us and get the best of us. And before the main title appears, here's a quick reminder of how important faith is. According to Hebrews 11:6 and Romans 5:2, our faith provides us access to the grace of God. And we know how important grace is. Our faith provides access to the grace, which entails forgiveness, life, both abundant life now and eternal life in heaven, and infinite spiritual blessings. So this whole series and today's lesson will complement this idea that your faith is everything. There is nothing more important than trusting God fully. And I hope this lesson helps strengthen within you a faith that fully, and I say fully, depends upon Christ. That's what we want, and that's what I know we have. But there are foes. Satan fears God. And I thought about this. Satan certainly knows God is more powerful. Yes, Satan is prideful and arrogant and big and bad and mad, but he knows God is more powerful. And yet Satan is skilled at some of these tools at which he gets people far from God's presence. This is a weapon that he uses to destroy our saving faith. And I don't want him to have victory over you on this. We need to slay the foe of self-reliance. In our text today, I hope you turn to Matthew 17. We will refer without reading so many verses. And the disciples were momentarily overcome by this foe, the foe of self-reliance. And they shamefully failed as a result of this because they forgot whose power makes all things possible. I can't imagine the arrogance of telling God, I've got this. I've got this. Because it's God's power through whom, again, not only all things make possible, but who gives us the power to do all things that we are able to do. Everything. Give credit to God. And yet I do wonder sometimes if God can in no other way interpret our thoughts and our behaviors in this way. when we essentially know that he has given his wisdom and his plan for us to read plain as day, and then we say, no thanks, God, I'll do it my way. I hope that never is the case for us. Well, I do pray that we also learn, and how do we learn? By conviction, by consequence, by even divine providence and discipline. However we learn, I hope we learn to change that way of thinking into more like the songs that we've sung this morning and other songs that we've known our whole lives perhaps. God, I need you every hour. I surrender all. Take my life and let it be consecrated, Lord, all to thee. Your will, not mine, by your power, not mine, but for your glory. Praise Jesus' name. The text today is Matthew 17, and verses 1 through 13 talk about the transfiguration. We've addressed that very recently. And Jesus had taken that inner circle that Ron talked about in class up on the mountain to witness the transfiguration, or I should say to witness the divine glory of the true nature of Christ, the Word in flesh, as he was transfigured before them. That experience should have been and was humbling and empowering. That experience should remind all of us today of who has the power, who has the authority. And this will explain some of the mounted frustration that the Lord then expressed as the verses continue in Matthew 17. He had frustration, and he expressed it over their unbelief, over their little faith. And in this case, you can look at those two phrases as the same thing. Jesus expressed frustration over this. So what exactly was their failure? What exactly was their failure? Well, when they came down from the mountain in verse 14, let your eyes glance to verse 14, they found a sad sight, a man whose son was demon-possessed, and they brought the son, or the father brought the son to the disciples for healing, and they could not heal him. They asked Jesus why. And in verse 20, Jesus essentially told them, now this is my words now, and I'll explain it. In my words, if you had any amount of faith that trusted in God's power at all, you could have done it. Whew. On your own time, read that text and see if that's not the tone in which Jesus is conveying. Your translation may not include verse 21. Now it might. It might have a footnote. It might reference it due to some manuscriptal evidence. But that's not a problem in the synoptic account, the parallel account of Mark chapter 9, verse 29. We at least know Jesus said that statement about prayer. Textual criticism, of course. So why? So how? Jesus said this type of demon is cast out only by prayer. Now think about this. If we're not careful, we might read verse 21 and fool ourselves, and I know I've done this, into forgetting, actually, the bold message of verse 20. Jesus, let your eyes glance to verse 20. He was pretty bold. And then he says what he did in verse 21. We could be thinking, oh, Jesus at the end of this stern rebuke is just now consoling them by saying, don't be upset. You couldn't have done this anyway. This type only comes out by prayer. Now, wait a minute. This is all within about a minute's time in unfolding, most likely. Is he consoling them, or is he continuing and intensifying his just chastising of them in this 2 to 3 verse sermon? It's very likely, and I do believe, the more I've looked at this, and I encourage you to think about this too, that the tone he began in verse 17 is the same tone in which he concludes 2 verses later in the 2-verse sermon in verse 20 and 21. Talking about praying, don't you know that those disciples spoke the petitions for that demon to come out? But by whose power? And that's the problem. It's obvious that they were not depending upon the Lord's power in this, but that they had forgotten where that power came from. If we talk about praying in faith, which the Lord just told them that they didn't have, then it's obvious here that they were relying on themselves. And incidentally, that was a time that they failed. This is why Satan wants us to rely on ourselves, because he can't beat God. And apart from our faith in God, Satan can much more easily target and defeat us. 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 8. Chad read this one. He's just looking for someone to devour. He knows he can't devour God, so he wants to get us far from God's power and protection. That faith which allows that power to flow through us. The song that was referenced earlier, that same power that raised Jesus from the dead, from the grave. What is self-reliance? It's self-defined. Relying on self. Relying on self. Philippians chapter 2 reminds us of a lot of things. And we recently had a whole series on Philippians chapter 2. But in summary, salvation is provided as a gift. And we then are told and we are shown how important it is that we obey Christ, that we follow obediently his will. That salvation gift of grace requires our due diligence to pursue righteousness. It requires that, walking in the light. But how easy is it for even command-following Christians to easily forget where the power of forgiveness comes from? I often remind us of this because I think for so many years, maybe decades, the congregations across the states have focused on their own doing and forgot God's hand in all of this. How easy is it to let that subtle foe, this brother of pride, fool him or her, to fool ourselves into thinking that salvation is now just entirely due to what we are doing, our own working. We have a type of illustration in Luke 18 where the Pharisees are seen as self-righteous. They were self-righteous because they were not depending upon God. They thought that they were righteous, so I don't need God. I just deserve his praise, I guess. That's a problem. What are some problems with self-reliance? I clicked print on the outline with just this idea of reconditioning is tough. We're raised to be self-reliant and independent, so reconditioning is tough, but that's not the approach I want to take. You'll have to add this note, James 3:16. Here's a big problem with self-reliance. It kills. James 3:16. What problems does Scripture say come from such foolish self-reliance or self-seeking pride? Essentially, every evil thing. I don't think that leaves anything out. Every evil thing. Just consider, as you remember the petition in our prayer a moment ago, the troubles of our day, from elevating our own wisdom and degrading others who are made in the image of God as well. Pride is addictive. Pride is deadly. And frankly, trusting in self is a mindset that if the Christian welcomes that into his or her life, it will kill the soul. Sin separates us from God, and God resists the proud. So, anyone who thinks that they can remain arrogantly self-reliant and enter heaven will find on that day a devastating surprise. This is how serious it is. Here's another problem with self-reliance. It cuts us off from God's power. Just specifically, it cuts us off both now and eternally. Let these verses on King Saul be a bonus devotional for you. 1 Samuel 11 and 15 and 16. He had great victories so long as he gave God the glory. And God will accomplish his will no matter what, of course. But so long as Saul gave God the glory, you have the victory. But somewhere that trend, that reliance shifted. And so did the results. Philippians 4:13. You know I love that verse, but I hate to read it just by itself. But the intent and context of that verse is so good. It says, We can endure, we can succeed in all things through God. That's the answer, through God. But when we rely on ourselves, we are cut off from that power we so desperately need. Number 3, a big problem is that it keeps us small and our accomplishments insignificant. This is interesting. People want to make a name for themselves, and that pride fuels such things. And we value and esteem excellence for the glory of God, but that's not always the motive or the motivation. If we're outside of God's will, we just might not see our tasks and projects in their true light for how they really are. We might see what we think is grand, and in reality, if we're apart from God, it's nothing. It's insignificant. If we're in God's plan, serving Him in all that we do, even a cup of water shared in His name is grand. His power gives that type of perspective as well. And I want that power of perspective. Here's a devotional for you. In Genesis chapter 5, verses 24 and following, the Enoch that you're most familiar with, Enoch, is the one who walked with God. Never had to die. God just took him. The other Enoch is in Genesis 4:16, and he was Cain's son. Cain went away from God, had a son, established a city named after his son Enoch. And what became of that? That city was destroyed by the flood. That city means nothing to us. But what about this other Enoch? What do we learn from him? We learn that true success is being right in God's sight. We learn that he was taken into that city, that eternal city that nothing can destroy, to be with God, and that is what makes heaven heaven, and that's where I'm going. Even Moses had his providential, humbling experiences in 40-year chunks. For 40 years being a shepherd. Wow. That would have been an anathema to his upbringing. But you and I see that was providential training. We remember him for being Israel's great deliverer. Why? Because of those times that he let God's power work through him. Those times that he relied on God, not himself. Enjoy these devotional verses today in your own time. Another problem with self-reliance is that it makes us religious, but not always righteous. In this context, the word religious obviously means ritualistic. The Pharisee in Luke 18 again was doing all kinds of great religious things, but the problem is he wasn't righteous. We're specifically told that he trusted in himself. His self-reliance kept him from being humble enough to enter God's presence. That's why even Christians serving the Lord hard are not immune to this attack. They are still vulnerable if not careful. Number 5, self-reliance leads us to defeat. Let's go back to our text, Matthew 17, beginning at verse 14 through 21. As your eyes are again looking over every word, I want you to see that the disciples tried to compete against the demon that had possessed this boy. The disciples tried. And try as they might, enhanced by the point that Ron made in his class, we can't fight against that on our own power. The big reason we don't want to fight or to rely on ourselves in a fight like that is that you're just not strong enough to defeat this enemy you're facing. You're just not. I don't want to face any enemy without God's power. What causes self-reliance? Nip it in the bud, they say, right? What causes self-reliance? I wanted to take a certain approach and did some good research, and I appreciate some good research by Edwin Crozier on this, and I decided to adapt his approach because I want to ask it this way. What ways of thinking, what habits of doing develop a person into being self-reliant, maybe more than he or she even knows? Now, that's a good question. I want to know. You know, a lot of people pray, as we should. Pray big for God to do great things through us to accomplish more than what we could do on ourselves. But so what develops into self-reliance? Letter A, never trying to accomplish anything more than what we think we can do on our own. The Israelites had this mindset. I've heard people ask me, you have asked me all the time, think of all the miracles that they saw. Think of all the things that they did. How could they not be just convinced to serve the Lord faithfully at every step of the way? Well, here's why. They had a slave condition mentality that cowered in fear. Think about that. That explains a lot. They cowered in fear. Remember the report of the spies? 10 of the 12 spies that were sent to survey the land of Canaan that God was going to give them came back and said, they're too big for us. That's technically true, and that's why they didn't follow through. 2 of the 12 said, not big enough for God. God can do this through us. And those 2 went on to a great victory later on, didn't they? They were the ones that got to see. Numbers 13. They knew that God was great enough to accomplish this for them. Here's another thing that causes self-reliance. Not recognizing God's hand or involvement in all things. Acts chapter 17, we see this here. God is credited for giving us life, for affording us all the things that we can do. We tend to focus on all these little things that we think we're doing, that we think we're planning and carrying out, but we forget God sustains us at every heartbeat of the way. It's God that is behind all of the sustenance of life. And if we focus on ourselves, we will forget what all God does. Here's another one. We get cocky over or arrogant over God-given victories. There are some things God's going to do because he's decided to go ahead and do it, whether you get the blessing or not. But we think about our past, and we think about the highlights of your Christian service that you just think, God was working through me. That's great in the moment, but as time goes on, you forget who still deserves the glory. Jesus had granted them the ability to cast out demons in Matthew chapter 10. So they had done this before. I can see them thinking, we've done this before, why can't we do it now? It wasn't their power ever. And so you can't rely on your past successes. Just keep depending on the Lord. And try to avoid comparison. Don't compare. We're told in Galatians 5 and 6, do not do this. Comparing ourselves is not good. It sets yourself up for either thinking you're better than or worse than others. And that's just either extremes, not good. The Pharisee in Luke 18 was self-reliant, and he evaluated himself far better than others. And it's ironic that the people he compared himself to, he actually needed to be more like. But no, he thought he was so far ahead of everyone else that was good enough. I don't need to even depend upon God because I'm already good. If we look to others, we will be arrogant. If we look to Christ, we will be humble. So now, here are the 5 steps. Here is the 5-fold strategy to overcome and have victory over this dreadful foe. Humility. Humble yourself. 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 6 through 7 says, humble yourself. And in context, that verse tells you how to do it. Specifically, petitioning and surrendering all things that you are anxious about. That's very interesting, isn't it? In our lesson about anxiety and worry, we mentioned this, that we tend to worry or have anxiety over the things we want to control. And we're told, give it to God. Humble yourself. It's humbling to ask God's guidance in all things. And I think it's a blessing to have a good memory over where following our way has led us. It's good to remember the trials that came our way when we did not seek God's way, because that motivates us to just keep following God. Hang on and hang out with the cloud of witnesses. I love Hebrews chapter 11 because of Hebrews chapter 12, 1 through 6. Their influence of strong faith and the victories that God gave them is so encouraging. They encourage me to run the race with endurance. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 1. I want you to notice something, though, how in each account, great things happen when these saints stopped relying on themselves. Their full story says, I was depending on myself at first, but then that didn't work. Then depend upon God, and great things happen. Think about Saul. King Saul, that is. He could not defeat Goliath, though he was armed to his teeth. He couldn't even go out to meet him on the battlefield. But David was able to go out and defeat Goliath because he was armed with God. Spend time in these accounts. And while you're doing so, pray. Pray steadily, continually, often, as a way of life. Jesus' own words come into play here in Matthew 17 and Mark 9:29. This kind comes out by prayer. Brethren, listen to Ephesians 6, verse 12. Here's a bonus verse. Our battle is against the principalities, the powers, the rulers of the darkness of this age, the spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places. If we are fighting an enemy that we cannot defeat on our own, we had better take up the panoply of God. Leave no unguarded place and stand entire at last. Every piece of armor that God uses for his battles and wins his victories, he supplied to us. Take it all up and live by truth. Walking in the light. That's your only defense. There is none other. As we're praying, we need to pray for boldness and strength. This is what happened for Peter and John in Acts chapter 4. They prayed after they had been arrested and threatened. They prayed and solicited others to pray for strength and boldness to preach the word of God. How do we attack this foe of self-reliance and stay in God's power? Acknowledge God. Acknowledge God in all your ways. This goes to the verse that Anderson read today, Proverbs chapter 3, verse 6. That passage, that proverb helps us combat self-reliance. How? By simply acknowledging God. Now, what does acknowledge mean? Of course, it means to adhere to it and follow it, but simply thanking God, as we're told in 1 Thessalonians 5:18, with all thankfulness, pray to God, thanking him for all things. I think that when we're praying to God and acknowledging God and thanking God for his involvement in all things, that's one way to apply this principle and keep self-reliance far from your life. And then, of course, hang on to Jesus, or hold on to Jesus. A life of faith is humbling and empowering because you're depending on God's power, and there is none better. Paul explains the opposite of this self-reliance in Philippians chapter 3, verses 7 through 11. And I want you to write that extra verse and read it before you go to bed tonight. Philippians 3, 7 through 11. He is devoted to Christ, and he wants us to be solely devoted. He knew that the only important thing is to be close to Jesus. And he would encourage us to cut off anything that would separate us from him and to throw ourselves into everything that would get us closer to him. And as we depend upon him more and more, the better we realize and recognize that it is only through him that we have that power and that we'll share in his glory. In conclusion, Satan likes being feared. Absolutely he does. A very prideful being. He knows his fate. He wants you to share in that. I'll say no thanks. Satan fears God. We know that Satan is powerful. If you get close to him, he's very powerful. I'd rather get close to God. Even Satan knows that God is more powerful. Therefore, Satan fears our faith in God. Now, for just a moment, that will make you feel really good. And then you might be subject to breaking every rule that we just discussed when you're thinking, Satan fears me. No, he doesn't fear me. He fears my faith in God. Don't go another day without being in the protection of his presence and his power. Galatians 3:27, without being clothed with his righteous garments. Literally, in him. We're baptized into him by faith, into the blood that cleanses our sin. And here's the question. As we think about building our faith and maintaining faith in God, will you begin the Christian walk fully depending on God's grace as you pursue righteousness, working out your own salvation with fear and trembling? As we do so, let us know and help you as we stand and